Hey, 14 feet of linen, that's all it is. And yet this one piece of cloth has made scientists lose sleep, driven the Catholic Church crazy for centuries, and started arguments that literally never end. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin, a burial cloth that either wrapped the body of Jesus Christ himself, or is the greatest, most insanely detailed medieval forgery ever pulled off by a human being. There is no in-between here. Here's what makes this wild. The image on the cloth is technically a negative, like a photo negative, which no one figured out until 1898, when a camera finally got close enough to reveal it. It encodes three-dimensional data that NASA equipment can read. There are forensic bloodstain patterns so accurate that modern crime scene analysts are baffled, and nobody, not a single scientist on Earth, can fully explain how the image got there. Not one. So today we're going thread by thread through the biggest mystery in religious history. We're covering the science, the scandals, the secret societies, and the moments where logic just breaks down. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I genuinely want to know, and if you're already hooked, hit like. It tells the algorithm this stuff matters. Alright, let's get into it. Before we start arguing about whether this thing is real or fake, and trust me, we will get there, and it's going to get messy, we need to slow down and actually look at what we're dealing with. Because most people who have strong opinions about the Shroud of Turin have never actually taken a close, careful look at the object itself. They've seen a thumbnail, formed a view, and moved on with their lives. Which, fair enough, that's basically how the internet works. But today we're doing something different. So let's start with the basics. The shroud is a single piece of linen cloth, roughly 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It's stored in a special climate-controlled case inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, because apparently even ancient relics need air conditioning now. Welcome to the 21st century. The cloth is off-white, yellowed with age, and at first glance, honestly, it looks a little underwhelming, like something you'd find folded at the back of a very old linen closet. You might walk past it in a museum and think, huh, that's a big tablecloth, cool, and then someone tells you to look more carefully and suddenly your afternoon gets very complicated. Because on this cloth, faint, almost ghostly like a watermark on ancient paper, there is the image of a man. Full body, front and back, as if the cloth was laid beneath the body, folded over the top, and somehow captured a kind of photographic imprint of whoever was inside it. The figure is tall for the ancient world, estimated at around 5 feet 11 inches, which in 1st century Judea would have made him practically a giant. The physique is lean but well built. The hair is long, falling past the shoulders. There is a beard. And there are wounds. A lot of wounds. This is where the image stops being a curiosity and starts being genuinely difficult to look at. Across the back of the figure, researchers have counted somewhere in the range of 120 distinct marks consistent with scourging, the kind inflicted by a Roman flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs tipped with small metal or bone pieces designed to tear flesh. Not a medieval torture device you'd read about in a fantasy novel. A very specific, very historically documented Roman instrument of punishment, and the marks on the cloth match its precise geometry with uncomfortable accuracy. The strikes come from 2 slightly different angles, suggesting 2 different soldiers taking turns, which, if you think about it for more than 3 seconds, is an absolutely horrifying detail to have preserved in textile form. Then there are the wrists. This is one of those details that quietly destroys a certain category of counter-argument, so pay attention. The wounds from nails are located not in the palms of the hands, the way crucifixion has been depicted in Western art for literally 1,000 years, but in the wrists, specifically in a region anatomists call the space of destot. Now why does that matter? Because in the 14th century, every single painting, every sculpture, every depiction of the crucifixion showed nails through the palms. That was the visual language of the era. That was what everybody believed. And yet this cloth shows wrists, which happens to be anatomically correct. The palms cannot support the weight of a human body during crucifixion. The tissue tears, the nails pull through. Roman executioners knew this. Medieval artists did not. So if a medieval forger made this cloth, they somehow got a detail right that nobody in their entire civilization was depicting correctly. Not exactly the behaviour of a guy banging out a quick fake in his basement workshop. There is also a wound in the side, the right side specifically, consistent with a penetrating blow from a lance or spear. Around this wound, researchers have noted a particularly interesting pattern. two distinct fluid trails, one appearing to be blood and the other a clearer, more watery substance, running at different angles in a way that matches what would happen if a person had been upright during crucifixion and then laid horizontal afterward. This dual trail detail is consistent with what forensic pathologists describe as a cardiac wound, where the pericardial fluid and blood separate after death. Again, not something a 14th century artist would have known, and not something you could fake by painting two slightly different coloured streaks on a piece of cloth and calling it a day. The head tells its own story. Distributed around the scalp and forehead are multiple small puncture wounds, forming a pattern that circles the entire skull rather than sitting like a simple crown. If you imagine a cap of thorns pressed down onto a head rather than a neat decorative ring sitting on top, which is how it's usually depicted in art, the pattern on the shroud matches what you'd expect. Every wound comes with its own blood trail, each at an angle consistent with the position of the head at the time the bleeding occurred. These aren't decorative splatters, they map to real physics. Now here's where the whole thing gets genuinely strange from a purely visual standpoint, and this is the detail that catches most people completely off guard the first time they hear it. The image itself is extraordinarily faint. We're talking barely there, almost invisible unless the lighting conditions are exactly right. Stand in front of the cloth from a normal conversational distance and you will struggle to make out what you're looking at. Step back to around 10 feet and the image suddenly snaps into clarity. The face, the body, the entire figure resolving like one of those magic eye posters from the 1990s. Any closer and it dissolves back into a vague brownish blur. This isn't a bug. It turns out it's a feature, and an inexplicable one, but we'll get into that in a later chapter when things get properly weird. What you can see clearly, even at normal distance, are the other marks on the cloth, the ones that have nothing to do with the body image. In 1532, a fire broke out in the chapel where the shroud was being stored in Chambéry, France. The cloth, folded in a silver reliquary, was nearly destroyed. When it was rescued and unfolded, a symmetrical pattern of scorch marks and burn holes ran along both sides, caused by molten silver dripping onto the folded layers. Poor nuns of St. Clair spent the following years stitching patches over the worst of the damage, which they did admirably, but the marks remain visible to this day, a series of triangular burn patches and water stains that look, when the cloth is laid out flat, almost like a pattern of dark diamonds down its length. So the shroud has survived fire, flood, centuries of storage, multiple relocations across Europe, and the general chaos of human history, while somehow keeping that faint central image intact. Which is either a miracle or an extraordinary piece of luck, depending on your perspective. The weave itself is worth mentioning because it's unusually sophisticated for its supposed period of origin. The pattern is what textile historians call a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, a complex interlocking diagonal weave that creates a subtle chevron texture across the surface of the cloth. This particular weave was known in the ancient world, including in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was expensive to produce and relatively rare. It's not the kind of fabric you'd pick up at the Jerusalem equivalent of a corner store. Linen of this quality and complexity was reserved for specific significant purposes, which, if the cloth is what believers claim it is, makes a certain kind of sense. And if it's a forgery, it means whoever made it spent serious money on premium materials. Medieval con artists apparently did not cut corners on the fabric budget. The dimensions of the cloth, the specifics of the weave, the trace pollens found embedded in the fibres, researchers identified plant species native to the area around Jerusalem, and the microscopic structure of the linen itself have all been studied, debated, restudied, and debated again by teams of scientists over the past several decades. Every time someone thinks they have the definitive answer, a new detail surfaces that complicates the picture, which is either deeply frustrating or deeply fascinating, again depending entirely on what you brought to the table when you started looking. What is not in dispute, even among the most committed skeptics, is that the object is genuinely unusual. Nobody looks at the Shroud of Turin and says, "Yeah, that's pretty standard, nothing to see here." The arguments are always about what it means, not about whether it's remarkable. Even the people who are absolutely certain it's a medieval fake acknowledge that it is the most sophisticated, most anatomically precise, most scientifically anomalous fake ever produced. Which is a strange kind of compliment when you think about it. Congratulations, unknown medieval genius. You created a forgery so perfect that it has baffled the entire scientific community for over a century. If that's the alternative explanation, it doesn't exactly make the mystery smaller. So that's the object. That's what we're actually dealing with before the arguments start. A 14-foot piece of ancient linen with a faint full-body image of a crucified man, anatomically correct wounds that didn't match medieval artistic convention, a sophisticated weave, fire damage from 1532, and enough embedded anomalies to keep. Research teams busy for another 100 years. Simple, right? Just a cloth. Nothing complicated at all. Hold that thought, because from here things are about to get significantly more complicated. Let's set the scene. It's 1898. Italy is celebrating the 400th anniversary of the House of Savoy, and as part of the festivities, the Shroud of Turin is put on public display for the first time in decades. Crowds line up to get a look at it. People pray in front of it. And among those visitors is a man named Secondo Pia, a lawyer by trade, a passionate amateur photographer by hobby, who has somehow managed to get official permission to do something no one has ever done before: photograph the shroud, properly. With a camera, under controlled lighting conditions. Now you have to understand what photography meant in 1898. This wasn't pulling out your phone and tapping a button. This was a laborious, technical, time-consuming process involving large glass plates coated in light-sensitive chemicals, long exposure times, and a dark room where you develop your plates by hand in trays of chemical solution, watching the image slowly emerge from the blank surface like a ghost coming through a wall. It was part science, part craft, and for someone like Pia, genuinely thrilling. He set up his equipment in the cathedral, arranged his lighting as carefully as conditions allowed, and made his exposures over the course of 2 evenings in May. Then he went to his darkroom to develop the plates, and here is the moment that split the entire history of the shroud into a before and after. Pia lifts his glass negative plate out of the developing tray and holds it up to the light, and instead of seeing the faint, difficult-to-read blur that everyone had been squinting at for centuries, he sees a face. A clear, three-dimensional, photographically realistic human face staring back at him from the negative. Defined features, coherent shadows, a face that makes immediate visual sense in a way the cloth itself never quite did. By all accounts, the man nearly dropped the plate, and honestly, who could blame him? You go in to take a routine commemorative photograph of an old religious artifact, and you come out having potentially changed the course of history. Not your average Tuesday evening. Here is why this matters so much, and why it remains one of the genuinely difficult facts about the shroud that even committed skeptics have to wrestle with. In photography, when you shoot a normal scene and develop the negative, light areas in the scene become dark on the negative, and dark areas become light. It's reversed. So a normal photograph of the shroud would show the cloth's image looking like a negative, because the cloth already is a negative. Pia's developed plate, being a negative of a negative, gave him a positive, a normal, correctly toned image. Which means the image on the cloth itself encodes tonal information in reverse. Shadows and highlights are flipped compared to what any painter, any illustrator, any visual artist working with pigment would naturally produce. Think about that for a second. When you paint something, when anyone paints anything, you put dark pigment in the shadow areas and leave lighter tones in the highlight areas. That's just how visual representation works. That's how it has always worked, in every artistic tradition, in every culture, across all of human history. It's not a technique. It's the fundamental logic of making images, and yet the shroud image does the opposite. The areas that should be bright are encoded dark. The areas that should be shadowed are encoded light. The result, when viewed directly, looks muddy and strange and hard to interpret. But invert it photographically, and suddenly everything resolves into a coherent, realistic, three-dimensional image. This is not something you do by accident. It's not something you stumble into. It is an extraordinarily specific and deliberate property, and it is a property that no medieval painter would have had any reason to create, because no medieval painter had any concept of photographic negatives. Photography wouldn't be invented for another 4.5 centuries. It would be like a 14th century forger building in a secret QR code. For what? For whom? To what possible end? Pia published his findings, and predictably the world lost its collective mind. Some people called it a miracle, some called it proof of authenticity. Others, because this is how the world works, immediately accused him of fraud, of manipulating his plates, of faking the results for religious reasons. The accusations were vicious enough that the debate effectively went quiet for years, waiting for someone to repeat the experiment and confirm what Pierre had seen. That confirmation came in 1931, when a professional photographer named Giuseppe Enrie was given access to shoot the shroud during another public exposition. Enrie was meticulous, methodical, and had no personal stake in the outcome. He developed his plates and got the same result. Same face, same reverse tonal structure, same jaw-dropping clarity in the negative that simply wasn't there in the positive, at which point the denial position became somewhat harder to maintain. Not impossible, this is the shroud, denial is always available as an option, but harder. What Pierre's discovery did, beyond the immediate theological earthquake, was force the conversation about the shroud out of the realm of pure faith and into the realm of science. Because now there was a specific, measurable, falsifiable physical property to explain. Not just, is the image old, or is the cloth old, but how physically does a pre-photographic object encode tonal information in the manner of a photographic negative? That question has driven decades of research, attracted physicists, chemists, forensic specialists, textile historians, and imaging scientists from institutions all over the world, and to this day, nobody has produced a fully satisfying answer, which either means the answer is something extraordinary or it means we're missing something. Both options are, frankly, fascinating. If the tonal reversal discovery turned the shroud into a scientific puzzle, then the forensic analysis of its bloodstains turned it into something closer to a crime scene report. And not in a sensationalized, dramatized way, in the actual clinical, this is what the evidence shows way that trained investigators use when they're reconstructing what happened to a person. Because what the stains on this cloth describe, when read by someone who knows what they're looking at, is a sequence of events that is precise, internally consistent, and medically specific in ways that go well beyond what any medieval artist, however talented, could have fabricated from imagination alone. Let's start with the scourge marks, because there are a lot of them, and they are extraordinarily detailed. The count varies slightly depending on methodology, but researchers consistently arrive at somewhere around 120 distinct impact sites distributed across the back, shoulders, chest, and legs of the figure. This alone is striking. Roman scourging was severe, sometimes fatal, and the number of strikes recorded on the shroud is consistent with a near-lethal pre-execution flogging of exactly the kind documented in Roman historical sources for condemned prisoners. But the detail that elevates this from "there are a lot of marks" to "something strange is happening here" is the geometry. Each mark has a specific shape, a dumbbell pattern, two small impact points connected by a short linear trace, which matches precisely the shape left by a flagrum, a Roman whip fitted with small bone or lead pellets at the end of each leather. Strand. This is not a generic beating. This is a specific instrument leaving a specific signature, and it does so with a consistency across more than 100 separate impacts that would require either direct experience with that instrument or an obsessive level of research into Roman punishment methodology. In the 1300s, for a forgery, sure. Furthermore, and this is the part that tends to make people pause, the strikes appear to come from two slightly different angular directions, one set hitting from the upper left and one from the upper right, in a pattern consistent with two individuals standing on opposite sides of the victim and alternating blows. This is documented Roman practice. It's also not something that shows up in medieval written accounts of the Passion in enough detail to serve as a reference. The artist, if artist there was, didn't get this from a book. They either got it from direct observation of a real flogging, or they got it from, well, the alternatives get complicated. Now, the blood itself. This is where the forensic analysts come in, and things get genuinely uncomfortable for the simple medieval painting theory. The stains on the shroud are not the red that artists of the period used to depict blood, that vivid, almost orange red that you see in medieval religious paintings. The stains are reddish-brown, in some places almost black, in a colour range consistent with aged whole blood. When samples were tested, and the testing has been contentious and complicated for reasons we'll get into, the results indicated the presence of hemoglobin and its breakdown products. There are also marks in a pattern consistent with serum separation, the pale halo that forms around a blood stain when the liquid component of blood separates from the cellular component after clotting. This happens when real blood dries on a surface. It is not something you replicate with paint, and it's not something a painter would have known to include as a detail, because the physics of blood drying wasn't understood at the medieval level of biology, which was, to put it charitably, not great. The wound in the side deserves its own moment. Located on the right of the figure, roughly between the 5th and 6th ribs, the stain shows a clear elliptical puncture mark with two distinct fluid trails extending from it downward. One trail darker and thicker, consistent with blood, the other lighter and more transparent, consistent with a watery fluid. These two trails run at slightly different angles because they were laid down at different times, one while the body was upright, the other after it was horizontal. This dual fluid pattern is medically consistent with a wound to the area of the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, where trauma causes blood and pericardial fluid to pool together. It was documented in medical literature in the 20th century. It was not documented in anything a 14th century forger would have had access to. And yet there it is, faithfully recorded on the cloth, right down to the angle differential caused by postural change. At this point, the fictional medieval genius capable of faking all this would have to have also been a qualified physician, a Roman military historian, a forensic blood analyst, and someone with access to a real crucifixion victim for reference. That's a very specific skill set. The head wounds continue the pattern. The puncture marks distributed around the scalp, which we talked about in the context of the thorn cap, each produce their own individual blood trail, and each trail runs at an angle consistent with the direction of gravity at the time the bleeding occurred. Some run vertically downward, consistent with a standing or sitting position. Some run horizontally across the forehead, consistent with a forward bowing posture. Some run in directions that only make sense if the head was tilted at a specific angle. When you map all of these out together, they don't contradict each other. They form a coherent picture of a body that moved through several different positions over an extended period while actively bleeding from scalp wounds. This is not artistic decoration. This is fluid dynamics applied to human anatomy. It is, frankly, a level of forensic storytelling embedded in a piece of cloth that has no business being there if the cloth was made by a human artist working from imagination. There's one more detail in the blood evidence that doesn't get mentioned as often but probably should. The blood stains and the body image are physically separate on the cloth. The image does not appear beneath the blood stains. This means the blood was in contact with the cloth before the image formed, or at minimum the image-forming process did not penetrate areas already covered by blood. If the cloth is a painting, the artist painted around the blood stains. If it is a contact impression of some kind, the blood was on the body first and served as a kind of mask. Either way, the relationship between the blood and the image is not random. It is structured, and it tells you something about the sequence of events that produced the cloth, though exactly what that sequence was remains, as with basically everything about this object, actively disputed. What the forensic analysts who have studied this cloth most thoroughly tend to agree on, across different institutions, different methodologies, different personal beliefs about the relic's origin, is that the bloodstain evidence is medically coherent in a way that is very difficult to explain as artistic invention. The patterns are too specific, too anatomically accurate, too internally consistent across too many separate details to have been designed purely from imagination. Whether that means the cloth wrapped a real crucifixion victim, or just that whoever made it had very unusual access to real forensic data, is, of course, the question everything comes back to. The blood speaks clearly. What exactly it's saying depends, as always, on who's listening. At this point in the story, you might be thinking, okay, unusual weave, reverse tonal structure, forensically accurate bloodstains. Remarkable, sure, but maybe there's still a rational explanation hiding somewhere. Maybe some extraordinarily dedicated medieval forger with a background in Roman military history and forensic pathology just had a very productive decade. Fine, hold that thought. Because we're about to add one more layer to this puzzle that is going to make the talented medieval artist theory significantly more difficult to defend. We're talking about the three-dimensional encoding problem, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the strangest properties ever documented in a physical object. To understand why this matters, we need to make a quick stop in the 1970s. Not for the fashion, though the 1970s had a lot going on there too, but because of what was happening in aerospace imaging technology. NASA, in its ongoing mission to map the surfaces of other planets and moons, had developed a piece of equipment called the VP8 image analyzer. The basic function of this device was to take flat two-dimensional photographs of planetary surfaces and convert the tonal data, the light and dark information in the image, into physical height values. Brighter areas get rendered as higher. Darker areas get rendered as lower. The result is a three-dimensional relief map built from photographic data. This worked brilliantly for mapping the Moon and Mars, because photographs of planetary surfaces contain genuine spatial information. Distance from the camera correlates with shadow length and brightness in a way that translates meaningfully into elevation data. Run a photograph of a lunar crater through the VP8 and you get an accurate 3D model of the crater. Clean, logical, scientifically useful. Now here is where it gets interesting. In 1976, a physicist named John Jackson, who was part of a broader research group that would eventually become the famous STURT project, the Shroud of Turin research project, decided, somewhat on a whim, to run a photograph of the shroud face through the VP8 analyzer. The logic was simple enough. If the shroud image was painted, the tonal variations would be purely artistic decisions, with no relationship to actual three-dimensional space. You'd get a distorted, meaningless blob on the output, the same way you'd get a garbled mess if you ran a normal portrait painting through the machine. There would be no coherent spatial data to extract, because a painter doesn't encode distance from viewer as brightness of pigment. That's just not how painting works. What came out of the VP8 was not a garbled mess, it was a face. A coherent, anatomically proportioned three-dimensional human face with correct spatial relationships, the nose projecting forward at the right distance, the eye sockets receding at the right depth, the cheekbones sitting at the right elevation, relative to the surrounding features. Not a rough approximation, not a vaguely face-shaped lump. An actual spatially accurate three-dimensional model of a human face, rendered from the tonal data of the cloth image, as if that data had been specifically designed to encode spatial distance rather than artistic shading. Jackson, by his own account, stared at the screen for a long time before saying anything, which seems like a reasonable response to having your afternoon completely derailed by a piece of ancient linen. For context on why this is so remarkable, consider what happens when you run any other historical image through the same process. Take a medieval painting of a face, any medieval painting, pick your favourite, and put it through the VP8. You get a distorted, spatially incoherent mess, because the painter's shading decisions were made for visual effect, not for geometric accuracy. The darkest areas aren't necessarily the most recessed areas. The brightest areas aren't necessarily the closest areas to the viewer. Artistic shading follows its own logic, and that logic doesn't map to real three-dimensional space. Take a Renaissance masterpiece, a Raphael, a Leonardo, the best portrait painting in the history of human art, and you get the same result. Spatial chaos, meaningless output. Because even the greatest painters in history were not encoding three-dimensional distance data into their tonal choices. They were making art. The shroud image, and the shroud image alone among all tested objects, produces a spatially coherent three-dimensional output. This means the tonal variations on the cloth, the subtle gradations of light and dark that are almost invisible to the naked eye and only resolve into a recognizable image at a distance, are not arbitrary. They encode, with apparent precision, the distance between the cloth and the body surface at every point. Where the cloth was close to the body, the image is more intense. Where the cloth draped away from the body, the image fades. The gradation follows physical geometry. It is, in effect, a distance map. Not a painting, not a rubbing, not a photograph in any conventional sense. A distance map encoded in the discoloration of linen fibers, built to a precision that NASA equipment can read and reconstruct 5 centuries after the fact, or 2,000 years after the fact, depending on which side of the dating debate you're on. Now, the immediate and entirely reasonable question is, could this happen naturally? If you wrapped a piece of cloth around a body and something caused the cloth to discolor in proportion to contact or proximity, would you automatically get 3D encoded tonal data? The answer, frustratingly, is sort of, but not like this. Contact mechanisms, where a substance on the body directly transfers to the cloth at points of physical touch, would produce binary data, contact or no contact. You'd get a shape outline, not a smooth gradient of distance information. Diffusion mechanisms, where something emanates from the body and affects the cloth over a range of distances, could in theory produce a gradient, but would also produce significant blurring and spreading that is not present in the shroud image. The shroud image has a resolution and a spatial precision that neither simple contact nor simple diffusion can explain cleanly. Which means either the mechanism was something considerably more exotic, or there are variables in the physics that researchers haven't fully characterized yet. Both options, again, are not exactly reassuring if you were hoping for a simple answer. The STIRT project, launched in 1978, brought together a team of roughly 40 scientists from various disciplines: physicists, chemists, biologists, imaging specialists, forensic experts, with access to state-of-the-art equipment and several days of direct contact with the cloth itself. They carried out X-ray fluorescence analysis, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, microscopic fiber sampling, and a range of other tests. Their collective conclusion, published after years of analysis, was that the image on the shroud was not produced by any pigment, paint, dye, or colorant of any kind. The image resides purely in the oxidized, dehydrated top surface of the linen fibers, a chemical change to the fiber itself, not the addition of any foreign substance. The depth of this change is extraordinarily shallow. The discoloration affects only the outermost fibrils of each thread, to a depth of roughly 200 nanometers. For reference, a human hair is approximately 80,000 nanometers wide. The image exists in a layer thinner than 1/400th of a human hair. No known artistic technique operates at this scale. No brush, no pen, no printing process of any historical era touches the world at 200 nanometers. It is physically not how human beings make images, and yet there is an image. A spatially encoded, three-dimensionally coherent, forensically precise image on a piece of ancient linen, created by a mechanism that produces changes at the nanometer scale across a surface 4 feet wide and 14 feet long, with no pigment, no binding agent, no underdrawing, and no brush strokes. If you handed this problem to a materials scientist today and said, "Explain the manufacturing process," they would look at you for a while and then explain quite carefully that they cannot. Not because they haven't tried, but because no manufacturing process they are aware of, including cutting-edge modern ones, produces this specific combination of properties. The closest working hypothesis in current research involves some form of intense, extremely short-duration radiation, essentially a burst of energy so brief and so intense that it scorches only the absolute surface of the fiber before the heat can conduct inward. Like the world's fastest, most precise laser, operating at a scale we can't replicate, across an entire human-shaped surface simultaneously. That's the closest science has gotten to an explanation. Make of that what you will. What the VP8 discovery did, beyond the immediate scientific shock, was reframe the fundamental question about the shroud. Before Jackson ran that test, the debate was essentially, is this a very old cloth, or is this a medieval forgery? After the test, the question became something harder. What physical process, operating in either the ancient or the medieval world, could produce an image with these specific properties? Photographic negative structure, nanometer depth fiber. Alteration, no pigment, spatial three-dimensional encoding, on a piece of linen? That is a question that remains, as of right now, without a complete and satisfying answer. The skeptics say there must be an explanation we haven't found yet. The believers say the explanation might be one that science isn't equipped to address. And the scientists, most of them, just keep running tests and publishing papers and quietly marveling at a piece of cloth that refuses, stubbornly and comprehensively, to behave like anything else in the world. So far in this story, we've watched the shroud accumulate anomaly after anomaly. Properties that don't fit, details that shouldn't exist, scientific measurements that raise more questions than they answer. You might be wondering, at some point did anyone just do a straightforward definitive test? Run the numbers, get a date, close the case? Yes. Yes, they did. In 1988. And it went about as smoothly as you'd expect from a story that has been refusing to cooperate with simple answers for 2,000 years. Let's rewind to the lead-up, because the context matters. For decades before 1988, researchers had been pushing for radiocarbon dating of the shroud. Carbon-14 dating, the technique that measures the decay of a radioactive carbon isotope in organic material to estimate its age, had been around since the late 1940s and had become one of the most reliable tools in archaeological science. By the 1980s, the method had been refined to a point where labs could work with very small samples and produce results with tight error margins. The logical question was, why not date the cloth? The answer, for years, was that the church wasn't ready to allow samples to be taken, both because the process is destructive and because, frankly, the institutional stakes of getting a bad result were enormous. If the cloth dated to the medieval period, that would be a headline problem. If it dated to the 1st century, that would be a different kind of headline problem. Either way, the result was going to land like a grenade. The church finally gave the green light in 1988, under carefully negotiated conditions. 3 independent laboratories were selected, one in Oxford, one in Zurich, and one at the University of Arizona in Tucson, all of which were among the most respected radiocarbon facilities in the world. The idea was that 3 independent results from 3 unconnected labs would produce a reliable consensus, eliminating the possibility of any single lab's error or bias skewing the outcome. In theory, a clean, airtight scientific process. In practice, the very first decision made, which piece of the cloth to sample from, turned out to be a problem so significant that it has been argued about ever since. The samples were cut from a single location on the shroud, a strip taken from one corner of the cloth, near an edge that had been handled extensively over the centuries. We're talking about a corner that had been touched, grabbed, held and folded by human hands repeatedly during numerous public exhibitions, private showings and relocations over a period of roughly 600 years. In the textile world, frequent handling does things to fabric. Oils, skin cells, environmental contaminants, and repair materials all accumulate in ways that can, in principle, affect the chemistry of the fibres. This particular corner, it was later argued, also showed signs of being a repaired section, an area where damaged or worn threads had been rewoven at some point during the cloth's medieval custody, potentially replacing original ancient fibres with newer ones. Not exactly the pristine, uncontaminated sample you'd want if your goal was to date the cloth as a whole, but this is what they took. 1 corner, 1 location, 3 labs. The results came back in October 1988, and they were, on the surface, devastatingly clear. All 3 labs returned dates clustering in the same range, roughly 1260 to 1390 CE, the medieval period. Exactly the window in which the shroud first appeared in documented historical records, specifically in a French diocese in the 1350s. The scientists announced their findings. The media ran with it. Headlines around the world declared with considerable enthusiasm that the Shroud of Turin was a medieval fake. The Archbishop of Turin accepted the results publicly. The story appeared to be over, case closed, move along. Except naturally it wasn't. And the unravelling of the 1988 result is a genuinely compelling story about how science can be done incorrectly, even by excellent scientists operating entirely in good faith, and about how the choice of a single sample location can invalidate an otherwise technically perfect analysis. The first serious challenge to the radiocarbon results came from textile expert Leoncio Garza Valdez in the mid-1990s, who proposed that the fibres contained a biological contamination, a layer of bacteria and fungi that had colonized the surface of the linen over centuries and whose carbon content could significantly skew a radiocarbon date. The biology community's reaction to this was mixed. Some researchers thought the contamination load required to shift the date by 13 or 14 centuries was unrealistically large. Others thought it was worth investigating. The debate produced papers, counterpapers, and a great deal of academic friction, which is basically science's love language. The more widely accepted challenge came from a different direction. In 2005, a researcher named Raymond Rogers, a physical chemist who had been part of the original STIRP team, and was, by his own description, initially skeptical of claims that the sampling location had been problematic, published findings in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochimica Acta that were difficult to dismiss. Rogers had obtained threads from the specific corner of the cloth used in the 1988 sampling and compared them chemically to threads taken from other areas of the shroud. What he found was that the corner threads were chemically different in several measurable ways from the main body of the cloth. They contained cotton fibres absent from the rest of the linen. They showed evidence of a coating consistent with a medieval dyeing or repair technique called French reweaving, a process where skilled craftspeople would repair damaged sections of valuable textiles by splicing in new threads and treating them. to match the colour and texture of the surrounding original material. The corner threads in Roger's analysis were not original ancient linen. They were a patch, a medieval repair job done well enough to be visually undetectable, but chemically distinct from the cloth it was meant to blend with. If Rogers was right, and his paper passed peer review at a credible journal, which means it was scrutinised seriously by other scientists in the field, then the 1988 radiocarbon test didn't date the shroud. It dated the patch. It told us when a medieval reweaver fixed a corner of an older cloth, which is a useful piece of information, but it is emphatically not the same as telling us when the cloth itself was made. This would be roughly equivalent to carbon dating the restoration paint on an ancient statue and then announcing that the statue was made in the 20th century. Technically accurate for the material sampled, completely wrong as a conclusion about the object. Embarrassing, in the way that science sometimes is when sample selection goes badly. Now, it would be irresponsible to present Rogers' findings as the definitive last word on this, because science doesn't work that way, and this particular field is especially contentious. The labs that conducted the 1988 tests have defended their results. Other researchers have argued that the contamination or repair hypothesis requires more evidence before it can be accepted as conclusively undermining the radiocarbon date. There have been calls for a new round of testing using samples from multiple locations across the cloth, using modern accelerator mass spectrometry techniques that can work with even smaller samples and produce even more precise results. The Church has not yet authorized additional sampling, which is either an institution protecting a sacred object from further damage or an institution nervous about what a second round of results might show, depending on your level of cynicism. What the radiocarbon controversy did, and this is perhaps its most lasting effect, was demonstrate with uncomfortable clarity that the shroud question cannot be resolved by a single test. The 1988 result was presented to the world as a clean scientific verdict, and it turned out to be a case study in how even rigorous methodology produces unreliable conclusions when the sample is wrong. This doesn't mean the cloth is old. It doesn't mean the cloth is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. What it means is that science said medieval is not a complete sentence, because the science that said medieval sampled a corner that may not have been original. The question of the cloth's age is, technically and genuinely, still open. This is the part where both sides of the debate get equally annoyed, which is usually a sign that the truth is somewhere complicated. The skeptics are frustrated because a test they considered definitive got picked apart on a procedural objection. The believers are frustrated because the procedural objection, however valid, is still not proof of antiquity. And the scientists are frustrated because they've been trying to study an object that sits at the intersection of religious devotion, institutional politics, and global media attention, which is not exactly the ideal environment for calm empirical inquiry. Nobody gets to feel good about how 1988 went. The cloth, meanwhile, just sits in its climate-controlled case in Turin, maintaining its characteristic refusal to be simple. What makes the radiocarbon chapter genuinely interesting, beyond the procedural drama, is what it reveals about the limits of any single line of evidence when you're dealing with something this complex. The cloth's age cannot be settled by one test, one sample, one discipline. It requires convergence across multiple independent lines of evidence, and right now those lines of evidence are pointing in different directions. The textile properties and pollen evidence suggest antiquity. The radiocarbon test suggested medieval. The image properties don't match any known medieval or ancient technique, and the forensic details align with first-century Roman practice. Each of these is a data point. None of them, alone, closes the case, and anyone who tells you the case is closed, in either direction, is either not paying attention or selling something. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're trying to track a single object across 2,000 years of human history, through wars, fires, looting, political upheaval, religious persecution, the collapse of empires, the rise of new ones, and the general chaos of civilization. Doing what civilization does. No GPS, no digital records, no centralized archive, just a patchwork of manuscripts, legends, church inventories, eyewitness accounts of varying reliability, and the occasional mosaic. That is the challenge of tracing the shroud's journey from its supposed origin to its current address in Turin. And it is, genuinely, one of the most fascinating cold case investigations in historical research, full of long silences, sudden appearances, and enough gaps to drive a careful historian to drink. Let's start at the very beginning, or at least at what claims to be the beginning. Somewhere in the 1st century CE, in the ancient city of Edessa, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, a city that was a significant hub of early Christianity, there exists a legend about a cloth bearing the image of Christ. The story, known as the Legend of Abgar, describes a king named Abgar V, ruler of Edessa, who was suffering from a serious illness and had heard about a healer in Judea whose reputation was spreading across the region. Abgar, displaying the kind of kingly initiative that presumably got you crowned in the first place, sent an envoy to this healer with a letter requesting a personal visit. The healer, according to the legend, couldn't make the trip himself. He had some prior commitments involving Jerusalem that were about to get very complicated, but sent back a cloth bearing his image, which upon delivery healed Abgar's condition. The cloth became a treasured object in Edessa, venerated by early Christians in the region. Now, historians treat this story with the appropriate level of caution, which is quite a lot of caution, because it is a legend. It exists in multiple versions with varying details, and legends about miraculous healing cloths in the ancient world were not exactly rare. The interesting thing is not the miracle content, it's the structural facts embedded in the legend that seem to persist across different versions. That there was a cloth, that it bore an image of a face, that it was kept in Edessa, and that it was considered extraordinary enough to be worth protecting. For several centuries after the supposed events of the legend, references to this cloth, variously called the image of Edessa or the Mandylion, appear in early Christian writings, and then, around the 4th century, it disappears. Gone. No more references, no explanation. Just silence for roughly 300 years, which in the business of tracking ancient objects is not a great sign. The silence breaks in 544 CE, and it breaks dramatically. According to historical sources from that period, during a siege of Edessa by Persian forces, the cloth was discovered hidden inside a wall above one of the city's gates, apparently sealed there for safekeeping at some earlier point, and then simply forgotten about, as you do. The discovery was treated as a miraculous sign. The cloth was credited with helping to repel the siege, and from that point forward it was venerated openly and officially in Edessa as one of the most significant Christian relics in existence. It acquired a formal name, the Holy Mandylion, and a prominent place in the city's religious life. For the next 4 centuries the Mandylion stayed in Edessa, which was by then under various rulers and experiencing the usual carousel of regional power changes that characterized the early medieval Middle East. Then, in 944 CE, something remarkable happened that is extremely well documented. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos I Lycopenos, who ruled from Constantinople, and was the kind of ruler who collected important things with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered that being emperor meant you could basically take whatever you wanted, decided he wanted the Mandylion. He dispatched a military force to Edessa and essentially offered the city's Muslim rulers a deal they were strongly encouraged not to refuse: the Mandylion in exchange for 200 Muslim prisoners, an enormous ransom payment, and a guarantee of immunity from Byzantine attack. The exchange was made. The cloth was transported to Constantinople with a formal procession and enormous ceremony, arriving on August 16th, 944, a date recorded in multiple contemporary Byzantine sources, with enough detail to be considered historically reliable. The cloth was installed in the imperial palace's chapel, given the highest liturgical status, and described repeatedly in Byzantine religious texts of the following centuries. Now here is where the Shroud hypothesis becomes genuinely interesting, because the descriptions of the Mandylion in Constantinople start to include some details that don't quite fit a simple cloth bearing a face image. Multiple Byzantine sources describe the relic as being folded in a way that only the face was visible, which, if you imagine the shroud folded in quarters, would present exactly a face image. There are references to the cloth being longer than expected when unfolded. There is at least one account describing additional details visible when the cloth was examined more closely, including marks on the body. These details don't fit comfortably with the idea of a small face cloth, but they fit very comfortably with the idea of a larger burial cloth that was folded and displayed only at the face section, perhaps to protect the more disturbing body imagery from general public view. It's circumstantial, yes, but it's the kind of circumstantial that historians pay attention to. The Mandylion stayed in Constantinople for over 2.5 centuries, until 1204, which was a very bad year for Constantinople specifically, and for Eastern Christendom generally. The Fourth Crusade, which had begun as an expedition to the Holy Land and ended through a series of financial and political disasters too complex to fully detail here, as a sack of one of the most culturally rich cities in the Christian world by other Christians. The Crusaders looted Constantinople with what can only be described as breathtaking thoroughness. Relics, artworks, treasures, sacred objects accumulated over centuries, all of it went into the general chaos of military plunder, dispersing across Europe in the luggage of various knights, nobles and clergymen who presumably felt that conquest entitled them to the contents of other people's churches. It was, in the words of one contemporary observer, a catastrophe for civilization. Not exactly the 5 Crusades they make it sound like in the textbooks. The Mandylion vanishes in 1204. There are references in the aftermath of the sack to a French knight who had possession of a significant burial cloth. Letters survive in which Baldwin II, the Latin Emperor of Constantinople, references a cloth associated with Christ's burial that was among the objects looted from the city. But tracking any single object through the chaos of post-sack Constantinople is about as reliable as trying to follow a specific grain of sand across a beach during a windstorm. The cloth disappears from the documentary record and it stays disappeared for approximately 150 years. And then, in 1356, a cloth appears in the small French diocese of Léré in the possession of a French knight named Geoffrey de Charny. De Charny was a respected military figure. He would later die at the Battle of Poitiers, memorably carrying the French royal banner, and he presented this cloth to a local collegiate church as an act of piety. The cloth was displayed, attracted pilgrims, and was described in terms that matched the shroud precisely. The local bishop, somewhat inconveniently, declared it a forgery and ordered the displays stopped, an objection based not on any scientific examination, but on the fact that no documentation of the cloth's origin had been provided. De Charny died at Poitiers in 1356 without ever explaining where the cloth came from. His heirs eventually resumed displaying it. It passed through several more generations of French noble custody, was transferred to the House of Savoy in 1453, survived the fire of 1532 in Chambéry, and was finally moved to Turin in 1578, where it has remained ever since. The gap between 1204 and 1356 is the problem. 150 years of missing history is not a detail. It is a chasm. Skeptics point to this gap as evidence that the cloth simply didn't exist before the 1350s, that de Charny or someone in his circle manufactured it, and that the whole pre-1204 history being attributed to it is pious fiction layered on top of a medieval forgery. Believers point to the chaos of the Crusader sack and the general unreliability of 13th century archival records as entirely sufficient explanation for why a cloth could have changed hands multiple times without generating documentation. Both positions are defensible. Neither is proven. This is the shroud in its natural habitat. What is genuinely interesting about the provenance question is not the gaps. It's the specificity of what surrounds the gaps. The Edessa cloth is described in sources going back to at least the 6th century. The Constantinople arrival in 944 is dated to the day in multiple independent sources. The 1204 disappearance coincides precisely with a well-documented historical catastrophe that scattered relics across Europe. And the 1356 appearance happens in France, in the possession of a family connected to the knightly networks that emerged from the crusading period. That is not a randomly shaped gap. It is a gap shaped like the specific historical event, the Fourth Crusade, that most plausibly explains it. Whether that counts as evidence or just a convenient narrative depends entirely on how comfortable you are with circumstantial reasoning. Historians, as a species, are professionally uncomfortable with it, which is why the debate continues. But as detective stories go, the trail from Edessa to Turin is about as compelling as cold cases get. If you've been paying attention to this story, you know we left the shroud in a very uncomfortable place at the end of the last chapter, vanishing into the chaos of the 1204 Crusader sack of Constantinople and not resurfacing in the historical record until 1356 in France. 150 years of silence, a gap big enough to drive a conspiracy theory through, and believe me, people have been doing exactly that for decades. But here's the thing. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence for what happened to the cloth during those missing years didn't come from a dramatic archaeological discovery or a high-tech scan. It came from a Vatican archive in 2009. and it involved the Knights Templar, which means we have officially entered the part of the story where things get genuinely strange. Let's back up and establish who the Templars were, because they deserve more than a passing reference. Founded in 1119, the Knights Templar were a military religious order established initially to protect Christian pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem after the First Crusade. They were monks who were also soldiers, which was a somewhat unusual career combination even by medieval standards, basically the 12th century version of a Navy SEAL, who also takes vows of poverty and chastity. Over the following 2 centuries, the Templars grew into one of the most powerful organisations in the medieval world. They had their own network of fortified commanderies across Europe, their own banking system. Genuinely, they invented many of the mechanisms of international finance, which either makes them proto-capitalists or just people who figured out that money travels better than gold, and direct accountability only to the Pope, bypassing the normal feudal hierarchy entirely. They were, for roughly 200 years, untouchable. Then, in 1307, the French King Philip IV, who was deeply in debt to the order and apparently decided that the most efficient solution to debt was to destroy your creditors, had every Templar in France arrested simultaneously on a single Octobus morning. The charges were heresy, idol worship, and a collection of other offences designed to justify the seizure of Templar assets. The arrests were followed by trials, torture, confessions extracted under conditions that modern courts would describe as inadmissible, and eventually the formal dissolution of the order in 1312. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, reportedly cursing both the king and the Pope from the flames, which is either a dramatic historical footnote or evidence that he had genuinely nothing left to lose at that point. During the trials, and this is where the Shroud connection enters the picture, Templar members were interrogated extensively about their initiation rituals and worship practices. Many confessions, extracted under torture and therefore of questionable reliability as historical evidence, described a mysterious idol called the Baphomet, which different accounts described as a head, a skull, a bearded face, or a figure on a cloth. Historians have puzzled over these descriptions for centuries, with most dismissing them as either torture-induced fiction or deliberate misrepresentation of legitimate religious practices. They were filed under medieval weirdness and largely left there. But in 2009, a Vatican researcher named Barbara Frail was working through documents in the Vatican secret archives, which sounds dramatic but is essentially a very large and meticulously organised repository of historical church records, when she came across something unexpected. Buried in a collection of Templar trial documents was a testimonial from a member of the order named Arnaud Sabatier, who described, as part of his initiation into the Templar order, being shown a long linen cloth on which the image of a man's face was imprinted front and back, and being required to venerate it as part of the initiation ceremony. Sabatier's description, a long linen cloth full-body image front and back, does not describe a small portable idol. It describes something that sounds very specifically like the Shroud. And crucially, the document dated this practice to around 1287, placing it squarely in the middle of the 150-year gap between the cloth's disappearance from Constantinople and its reappearance in France. Now, Frail's findings were published and reported, and the reaction was, as you might expect, mixed. Some researchers found the Sabatier document compelling as circumstantial evidence that the Templars had the Shroud during the gap years. Others pointed out that a single testimonial from a man being interrogated under the threat of torture is not the most robust historical foundation. Both positions are reasonable. But here is the thread worth pulling. Geoffrey de Charny, the French knight in whose possession the Shroud first officially appears in 1356, had a relative, possibly a grandfather, the genealogy is debated, named Geoffrey de Charny, who was among the Templars arrested in 1307 and who died in prison before the order was formally dissolved. This may be coincidence. It may also be the kind of coincidence that historians describe in carefully neutral language as suggestive. The Shroud passing from Templar custody to the de Charny family after the order's destruction would explain the 150-year gap, the lack of documentation, because you would not document your possession of an object confiscated by the Crown, and de Charny's subsequent refusal to explain where the cloth came from. My family got this from a dissolved heretical military order that the king burned is not, diplomatically speaking, a great origin story to be sharing in 14th century France. This is also where the Gnostics enter the picture, and the connection is stranger and more philosophical than the Templar thread, but bear with it because it's worth understanding. Gnosticism was a diverse collection of early Christian movements and pre-Christian movements and non-Christian movements that borrowed Christian vocabulary, that shared a broadly common worldview, that the physical world is a kind of illusion or prison, that true reality is spiritual, and that hidden knowledge, gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge, is the path to understanding the real nature of existence. Gnostic theology varied wildly from sect to sect, but a recurring theme was the idea that the material world is a degraded copy of a higher spiritual reality, and that appearances, physical forms, images, and material objects are shadows of a deeper truth rather than the truth itself. Some Gnostic texts and traditions went further and articulated something that, when you read it in the context of the Shroud's properties, is genuinely startling. Certain Gnostic thinkers described creation in terms of a higher dimensional reality being projected into a lower dimensional form, the universe, as a kind of emanation from a spiritual source into physical matter, with the physical serving as a container or imprint of something beyond it. The language varies. The metaphysics are dense and not everyone's idea of light reading, but the structural concept, a three-dimensional reality encoded in a two-dimensional form, the physical as a kind of imprint or shadow of the spiritual, maps onto the Shroud's most anomalous property with uncomfortable precision. The Shroud encodes three-dimensional spatial information in a two-dimensional surface. Gnostic theology described the physical world as a two-dimensional shadow of a higher three-dimensional spiritual reality. Whether this is a meaningful coincidence, a retrospective pattern match, or evidence of something genuinely weirder is a question that is probably above everyone's pay grade. The Templar connection to Gnosticism is itself a matter of historical debate. The charges brought against the Templars in 1307 included accusations of heretical beliefs, contact with non-Christian philosophical traditions during their time in the Holy Land, and initiation rituals that incorporated elements foreign to Orthodox Christianity. Most historians treat these charges with skepticism, since they were generated by a politically motivated prosecution and extracted under torture. But the Templars did spend nearly 2 centuries in intense contact with the intellectual and religious culture of the medieval Near East, which was considerably more philosophically diverse than Western Europe at the time. Whether any of that contact influenced their theology is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that by the time of their dissolution, they were an organization with secrets about their rituals, their initiation practices, and apparently, if Sabatier's testimony is to be believed, about a long linen cloth with an image on it that they kept and venerated outside the knowledge of the wider church. What all of this adds up to, the Templar trial documents, the de Charny family connection, the Gnostic parallels, the 150-year gap, is not proof of anything in the strict sense. It is a constellation of circumstantial evidence arranged around a central absence, the way astronomers can infer the presence of a dark object from the behavior of the light around it. You cannot point to the shroud in Templar hands. You can only point to the shape of the gap, the description in a Vatican archive, the family name that connects the end of one chapter to the beginning of another, and the philosophical tradition that might explain why someone would protect a linen. Cloth as sacred knowledge rather than simply displaying it as a miracle. It is, as historical mysteries go, more coherent than it has any right to be, and it is not, by any stretch, the end of the story. So far in this investigation, we've been dealing mostly with what we might call active evidence. Tests run, documents found, measurements taken, arguments made by scientists and historians who are consciously engaged with the shroud question. But there is another category of evidence that tends to get less attention, partly because it's quieter, and partly because it requires a different kind of attention to appreciate. These are the passive witnesses, objects and images from the historical record that weren't created to make an argument about the shroud, that predate the modern debate by centuries, and that contain details no forger working after the fact could have planted there. They are, in the best possible sense, accidentally incriminating, and once you know what to look for, they are very difficult to dismiss. The first and most remarkable of these silent witnesses is a manuscript that most people outside the field of medieval art history have never heard of. In 1192, some historians place it as early as 1131, the dating is debated, but the conservative scholarly consensus settles on the late 12th century. a group of Hungarian monks at the Benedictine monastery of Pray produced an illustrated codex, known today as the Pray manuscript, or Pray Codex, named after the 18th century Jesuit scholar who first brought academic attention to it. The manuscript is a liturgical text, a collection of prayers and religious calendars, and it is illustrated throughout with pen and ink drawings in the style typical of Romanesque religious art, not particularly sophisticated by the standards of later centuries, but detailed enough to be informative. It is currently held in the National Széchenyi Library in Budapest, where it has been sitting quietly for the better part of 1,000 years, waiting for someone to notice what is on page 28. Page 28 contains a series of illustrations depicting the burial and resurrection of Christ. In the lower panel, two figures are shown carrying an empty burial cloth, and this cloth is illustrated with two specific details that should not be there if the Shroud of Turin is a 14th century forgery. First, the textile pattern drawn on the cloth shows a clear herringbone weave, the same distinctive 3-to-1 diagonal pattern that characterizes the shroud and that is not commonly found in medieval European textiles. The monk who drew this illustration was depicting a specific weave structure, not a generic cloth. Second, and this is the detail that tends to make researchers stop and stare, the illustrated cloth shows a series of small L-shaped or irregular marks arranged in a pattern that matches, with uncomfortable precision, the arrangement of burn holes on the Shroud of Turin caused by the 1532 fire in Chambéry. The same burn holes on a manuscript drawn more than 300 years before the fire happened. Let that settle for a moment, because the logical implications are fairly significant. The 1532 fire damaged the shroud in a specific documented pattern, a series of symmetrical burn marks along the fold lines of the cloth, caused by molten silver dripping onto it when the reliquary case partially melted. That pattern is distinctive, non-random and directly traceable to a specific historical event in a specific year. If the Pray manuscript, dated to the late 12th century, depicts a burial cloth with marks in that same arrangement, one of the following must be true. Either the illustrating monk was depicting the actual shroud, and those marks already existed on the cloth before 1532, which means the fire damage interpretation is wrong, and the marks are older than we thought. Or the cloth depicted in the manuscript is a different cloth that coincidentally had marks in the same pattern, which stretches coincidence to its absolute breaking point. Or, and this is the option that tends to make skeptics deeply uncomfortable, the Pray manuscript is depicting the actual shroud as it existed in the late 12th century, complete with marks that were already there, which means the shroud itself predates 1192 by enough time to have reached Hungary and been accurately documented there. None of these options are especially comfortable. The manuscript doesn't care. The herringbone detail adds a separate layer of difficulty for the forgery hypothesis. We established in an earlier chapter that the shroud's 3-to-1 herringbone twill is an unusual and specific weave that was known in the ancient world, but was not the standard textile for medieval European religious objects. If a medieval forger made the shroud in the 1300s and wanted it to pass as an ancient burial cloth, they presumably would have used a weave appropriate to the claimed period and region, which the herringbone actually is, for 1st century Judea. But the point is that an illustrator in 12th century Hungary, drawing a burial cloth associated with Christ, used a herringbone pattern. Not because herringbone was the default visual shorthand for burial cloth, it wasn't. Because the illustrator was depicting something specific, something he or someone in his source chain had actually seen. The Pray manuscript, in other words, is not just consistent with the shroud's existence before 1192, it appears to document it. Now let's move from Hungary to northern Spain, because there is a second silent witness sitting in a reliquary in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, and it has been there since at least the 7th century. The sudarium of Oviedo is a small cloth, roughly 84 by 53 centimetres, with no image on it whatsoever, just stains. Mostly blood stains and what appear to be pulmonary edema fluid stains, the kind of fluid that accumulates in the lungs under certain forms of respiratory distress and can be expelled through the nose and mouth after death. The cloth's documented history in Oviedo goes back to 616 CE, when it was brought to the city during the Muslim conquest of southern Spain as part of a collection of relics being moved northward for safekeeping. Before that, historical records place it in Toledo, and before Toledo in Cartagena, and before Cartagena, according to the records that accompany it, in Jerusalem, where it had been since the 1st century. This is, admittedly, a chain of provenance that relies on ecclesiastical records of varying reliability, but the physical evidence is where it gets interesting. The bloodstain patterns on the sudarium have been analysed extensively by forensic researchers, and the results keep pointing in the same direction. The stains are consistent with blood from a face, specifically a bearded male face, pressed against the cloth from the outside in a position consistent with a person whose head was bowed forward and slightly to the right, with breathing having recently ceased. The blood type in testing conducted in the 1990s was identified as AB, the same blood type identified in testing of the Shroud of Turin stains. The stain geometry, when researchers attempted to overlay the sudarium's pattern against the face area of the shroud, showed a correspondence that matched at multiple specific points: the nose position, the beard area, the distribution around the cheek. This is not a rough general similarity. It is a point-by-point alignment suggesting that both cloths were in contact with the same face. The pollen evidence adds yet another layer. Samples taken from the sudarium contain pollen from plant species native to the Jerusalem region, species that do not grow in Spain, that did not grow in medieval Europe, and that have no business being embedded in a cloth that was supposedly woven locally. Among the identified species are types found specifically in the area around Jerusalem and in the Jordan Valley, consistent with a cloth that spent time in that specific geographic region before being transported northward. Pollen doesn't migrate. It doesn't appear in a cloth because someone wished it there. If you find Jerusalem-specific pollen in a cloth that has been documented in Spain since the 7th century, the straightforward interpretation is that the cloth was in Jerusalem before it was in Spain, which is exactly what the accompanying provenance records claim. The pollen story gets even more specific when you look at the shroud itself. Researchers, most notably the Swiss criminologist Max Frey-Sulzer, who developed the sticky tape sampling technique used to lift pollen from crime scene surfaces and applied it to the shroud in the 1970s, identified dozens of pollen types embedded in the shroud fibres. Many of these were from plants native to Western Europe, consistent with centuries of storage in France and Italy. But a significant proportion were from plant species found specifically in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey, Israel, the region around Jerusalem. Some of the identified species bloom only in spring, in the specific window of the Jewish Passover calendar. Frey-Sulzer's methodology has been debated, and some of his identifications have been questioned by other palynologists, so this evidence carries a reasonable asterisk. But the core finding, that a cloth currently stored in Italy contains pollen from plants that only grow in Israel, is not easy to explain if the cloth was manufactured in medieval France or Italy. Taken individually, each of these silent witnesses has an asterisk attached. The Prey manuscript dating is argued. The sudarium blood type testing used older methods. The pollen identifications are disputed. Historians are professionally allergic to placing too much weight on any single piece of circumstantial evidence, and they are right to be. But the direction in which all of these pieces point, a cloth with a documented visual record predating 1192, a companion cloth in Spain with physically matching bloodstains and geographically specific pollen, and Jerusalem origin pollen embedded in the shroud's own fibres, is not random. It is a consistent direction. All of these silent witnesses, independently produced and independently analysed, are telling roughly the same story: that the cloth they reference is old, that it was in the Middle East before it was in Europe, and that it matches physical evidence. From a companion relic that has been in documented custody since the 7th century. They cannot be forged retroactively, they cannot be planted, they are simply there, having been there for centuries waiting for someone to ask the right questions. At this point in the story, we have covered a remarkable amount of ground. We have looked at the cloth's physical properties, its forensic bloodstain patterns, its photographic negative structure, its three-dimensional spatial encoding, the radiocarbon controversy, the centuries-long documentary trail, the Templar connection, the Hungarian manuscript, and the companion cloth in Spain. What we have not yet done is confront the most human question of all, the one that sits quietly underneath every scientific paper and archival discovery and imaging analysis. What did this person actually look like? Because everything we have discussed so far has been about the cloth, and somewhere, embedded in that cloth, is a face. A specific individual human face that no one in the modern world has ever clearly seen, until a visual effects artist from New York decided to spend 6 months of his life trying to find it. The person in question is Ray Downing, and his professional background is about as far from medieval religious scholarship as you can get. Downing spent his career doing high-end computer-generated imagery for television and film, the kind of work where you take digital data and coax it into something that looks and moves like a real human being. He had worked on historical reconstructions before, building digital faces for documentary projects, and he understood from professional experience both the possibilities and the severe limitations of facial reconstruction from incomplete data. When he was approached to attempt a reconstruction of the Shroud face for a documentary project, his initial reaction was apparently something along the lines of cautious skepticism. He had seen what the Shroud looked like. He knew how little visual information was actually there. What he didn't fully appreciate yet was how much information was hidden inside what appeared to be almost nothing. The first challenge was the one we have already discussed. The image on the cloth is extraordinarily faint. Not just faint in the way an old photograph is faint, but faint in the sense that it hovers right at the threshold of perception, resolving into coherence only at a distance and dissolving back into blur up close. For a computer artist accustomed to working with high-resolution digital assets, this was like being handed a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are the same color as the table they're sitting on. You know something is there. You just cannot see it clearly enough to work with directly. The technique Downing applied to this problem was a mathematical process called a fast Fourier transform, a computational method that breaks down a complex signal into its component frequencies, allowing you to isolate and filter specific elements of an image. In practical terms, think of it like the noise-cancelling function on high-end headphones. The algorithm identifies the regular, repetitive pattern of the linen weave, the background noise of the fabric itself, and mathematically subtracts it from the image data, leaving behind only the information that doesn't belong to the weave pattern. What remains once the texture of the cloth is filtered out is the image, isolated, clarified, stripped of its background for the first time in however many centuries it has been sitting there. The results of this filtering process were, by Downing's own account, unexpected in their level of detail. With the weave noise removed, the facial features of the Shroud image became substantially clearer. Not photographic, not fully resolved, but coherent enough to work with as a sculptural reference. And importantly, the image showed something that is very difficult to fake or extrapolate: genuine asymmetry. The face on the Shroud is not symmetrical in the idealized way that paintings tend to be. The nose is slightly off-center. One cheekbone sits fractionally differently from the other. The brow line is uneven. These are the characteristics of a real individual face, not an artist's idealized construction, and they survived the Fourier filtering process intact, which means they were embedded in the original image data, not introduced by the reconstruction process. The second major technical challenge was the distortion problem. When a cloth wraps around a three-dimensional object, in this case, a human body, the flat surface of the cloth doesn't maintain a simple parallel relationship to the body beneath it. It drapes, stretches, folds, and compresses in ways that depend on the geometry of what's underneath. If you then lay that cloth flat, the image it carries will be distorted in ways corresponding to how the cloth was draped. Stretched areas will compress, compressed areas will spread, and the whole thing will look subtly wrong in ways that are difficult to define but immediately register to a trained visual eye. This is one reason why the Shroud face, even when clearly seen, has a quality that doesn't look quite like a normal face. The image was formed on a three-dimensional surface and then flattened. Downing used the three-dimensional data we discussed in the VP8 chapter, the encoded spatial information in the cloth's tonal gradations, to mathematically reverse engineer the draping geometry and correct for these distortions effectively, unfolding the image back onto the shape it originally recorded. The result was a facial geometry that, for the first time, could be interrogated as a real three-dimensional structure rather than a distorted two-dimensional projection. After several months of this work, filtering, correcting, building, refining, Downing had a three-dimensional digital model of a face, a specific face. Not a generic artistic reconstruction in the tradition of, here is what a man from first-century Judea might have looked like, but a face derived directly from the data in the cloth, following the geometry the image itself specified. The face is angular rather than soft. The nose is prominent and slightly asymmetrical. The brow is strong. The hair falls past the shoulders, The beard is full. The overall impression is of a man in his 30s, with features that are consistent with the Levantine region, not the blonde, blue-eyed Christ of Northern European religious art, and not any of the other dozens of artistic traditions that have put their own cultural stamp on the iconography over the centuries. Just a face, a specific, individual, unrepeatable face that had been sitting in a linen cloth in Italy for longer than anyone can definitively say. But then Downing did something that elevated the project from impressive technical reconstruction to something considerably more thought-provoking. Having built his digital model of the shroud face, he decided to test a hypothesis about the mechanism that might have created the original image. The working theory, one of several proposed by physicists and imaging specialists, and the one that best fits the known properties of the image, is that the image was produced by some form of directional energy emanating outward from the body, affecting the cloth surface in proportion to the distance between the body and the cloth at each point. Essentially, a burst of something, radiation, light, some other energy form, radiating outward from the body surface and scorching the cloth in a way that encoded both the shape of the body and the distance to the cloth surface in the intensity of the effect. To test whether this mechanism could produce the kind of image seen on the shroud, Downing set up an experiment using his own face. He created a three-dimensional scan of his own face, then mathematically simulated the projection of that facial geometry onto a flat surface using the directional energy model, essentially asking the computer if energy radiated outward from this face and struck a flat cloth, what would the resulting intensity pattern on the cloth look like? The output was an image on a flat surface with tonal gradations encoding the distance from the face to the cloth. Then he ran that simulated image through the same Fourier filter process he'd used on the shroud, and the result was a coherent, recognizable reconstruction of his own face, with the same properties as the shroud image, the same negative tonal structure, the same three-dimensional spatial encoding, the same resolution characteristics. This result does not prove what created the shroud image. It proves that the directional radiation model is physically capable of producing an image with the specific properties the shroud image has, and that those properties are not random or arbitrary, but are precisely what you would expect from that particular physical mechanism. In other words, the image on the cloth is consistent with having been produced by a burst of directional energy radiating outward from a human body. What generated that burst of energy? Whether it was natural decomposition chemistry, some form of electrical discharge, a phenomenon we don't have a good scientific model for yet, or something that falls outside the framework of physical explanation. Entirely is the part that the technology cannot answer. Downing was careful to say exactly that. The technology decoded the method, not the meaning. The how is closer to answered. The why remains precisely where it has always been. The face that emerged from this process became the centerpiece of a documentary that aired internationally and introduced millions of people to a version of the shroud face that had never been publicly presented before. Not as a painting, not as an artistic interpretation, but as a direct computational derivation from the data in the cloth itself. The reaction was, predictably, divided. Believers found confirmation of what they already believed. Skeptics pointed out that a reconstruction is only as reliable as its assumptions, and that assumptions about draping geometry and image formation mechanism introduce variables that could substantially alter the output. Both reactions are fair. What is harder to dismiss is the simple fact that a face is there, a coherent, asymmetrical, anatomically consistent face with individual characteristics, derived from a cloth that Stirp determined contains no pigment of any kind, produced by a mechanism that no known human technology of any era can fully replicate. Whatever it is not nothing. And for all the centuries of argument and analysis and controversy, the face on the cloth looks back at every generation with the same patience it has always had, neither confirming nor denying, simply present in the way that the most genuinely mysterious things tend to be. Strip away the theology, strip away the history, the provenance debates, the Templar conspiracy threads, the Hungarian manuscript, the Vatican archives. Strip away everything that requires interpretation and just leave the object and the physics. What you're left with is a deceptively simple question that has been resisting a complete answer for decades. What physical mechanism produced the image on this cloth? Not who, not when, not why, just what. What process, operating on linen fibers, created the specific set of properties we have been cataloguing throughout this story. Because the answer to that question, whatever it turns out to be, is the answer to everything. And right now, the honest answer from the scientific community is, we are close, but we are not there yet. And close but not there on this particular question is considerably more interesting than a clean resolution would be. Let's start with what we know for certain, because it is both the foundation of the physical puzzle and the reason the puzzle is so hard. The image on the shroud exists in the form of chemical changes to the very surface of the linen fibres, a dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose that makes up the thread, which causes those fibres to turn a yellow-brown colour. There is no foreign substance involved, no paint, no ink, no dye, no organic compound that doesn't belong to the linen itself. The STIRP analysis established this conclusively using X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, and direct microscopic examination. Every technique capable of detecting the presence of foreign materials was deployed, and none of them found any. What they found instead was chemically altered linen and nothing else. The image is the cloth, not something applied to the cloth, which sounds almost poetic until you start thinking seriously about what that means for the mechanism. The depth of the alteration is the part that should genuinely disturb anyone who thinks about it carefully. The yellowing that forms the image affects only the outermost fibrils of each thread. We are talking about a layer of change that penetrates to roughly 200 nanometers, which is about 1/400th the width of a human hair. Below that boundary, the fibre is completely unaffected. The change is extraordinarily shallow, and it is extraordinarily uniform across the entire extent of the image, with its subtle gradations from more intense to less intense. The depth of the alteration stays within that same nanometer scale range. It does not go deeper in the darker areas. It does not thin out erratically. It is a precisely controlled surface effect covering a surface roughly the size of a large adult human body, applied with a resolution and a uniformity that no known artistic or manufacturing technique operating in any historical period can produce. A laser, working at the modern state of the art, could produce localized changes at this scale. But a single laser would take years to cover the area of the shroud at the necessary resolution, and the image would show the pattern of sequential scanning rather than the organic, continuous gradation that is actually there. So even that doesn't work cleanly. The light hypothesis was the first and most intuitive place researchers went, and it is still the most productive working framework, though it comes with its own set of paradoxes. The logic is straightforward. If you expose organic material to sufficient light energy, you can cause the surface to discolor through oxidation. Photography works on a related principle. The idea that some form of intense light burst caused the image on the shroud is not inherently absurd. It is, in fact, the hypothesis that has received the most serious scientific development. The problem is that light, as a mechanism, doesn't naturally produce images with the specific properties the shroud image has. Here is the core paradox. If you illuminate an object with a directed light source, a beam of light hitting from one angle, the way sunlight works or the way a studio light works, you get an image shaped by that directionality. Shadows fall on one side. Highlights appear on the other. The resulting image encodes information about where the light came from, not just about the shape of the object. The shroud image shows no such directionality. There is no single light source shadow. The tonal gradations correspond purely to the distance between the body and the cloth surface, with no indication of any particular direction of illumination. It does not look like an object lit from outside. It looks like an object that was itself the source. Conversely, if you use diffuse light, light coming from all directions equally, like light in a completely overcast sky or inside a light box, you get a different problem. Diffuse illumination tends to produce soft, low-contrast, detail-poor images because the shadows that create detail and definition are suppressed by light coming from all directions simultaneously. The shroud image is not soft or detail-poor. It has the precise facial geometry that survived Downing's reconstruction and the spatial accuracy that the VP8 confirmed. It has the resolution of directed light with the directionality profile of diffuse light, which is a combination that standard optics doesn't produce. Directed or diffuse, single source or multi-source, none of the conventional light models gives you the image that is actually there. This is where John Jackson's contribution becomes central. Jackson, the physicist who ran the VP8 analysis in the 1970s, and who spent much of the following decades developing physical models for image formation, proposed what he called the collimated radiation model. The concept is this. Imagine a light source that emits radiation not in a cone, not in a diffuse cloud, but in extremely narrow parallel beams projecting straight outward from the surface of the emitting body, like a very dense array of tiny lasers, all pointing directly away from the skin, perpendicular to the surface at each point. The behavior of this kind of radiation, mathematically modeled against a cloth draped over a body, produces an image with the exact properties the shroud has. The intensity of the effect at each point on the cloth corresponds directly to the distance from the body surface to the cloth. Close proximity gives strong effect, greater distance gives weaker effect, and the angular geometry of the parallel beams means the illumination is directionless from the perspective of the cloth. You get spatial depth encoding without directional shadow, you get resolution without a point source, you get, in other words, precisely the image that is on the shroud. The model works mathematically. The challenge, and it is a significant one, is that collimated radiation of this kind, emanating from an entire human body surface simultaneously, is not something that occurs in nature under any conditions we currently understand. A laser produces collimated light from a single point source. To produce it from an entire extended three-dimensional surface, from every point on that surface simultaneously, and perpendicular to the local surface normal at each point, would require either an inconceivable array of individually aligned sources, or a physical mechanism that simply doesn't exist in our current model of how energy behaves. Jackson himself has been careful to note that his model describes the geometry of the radiation that would be required, not the physical origin of that radiation. The model is complete. The explanation for the model is not. There have been other proposals. A team of Italian researchers from ENEA, the Italian National Agency for New Technologies and Energy, published work in 2011 describing experiments in which they used a high-powered ultraviolet excimer laser to produce coloration on linen that, in some respects, resembled the shroud image. Their conclusion was that to reproduce the intensity and superficiality of the shroud image across its full extent would require a UV light source of such extraordinary power that no known natural process or human technology could generate it. They were not claiming this as proof of anything supernatural. They were a national energy research agency, not a theology department, but their results effectively ruled out the hypothesis that a sufficiently powerful UV lamp in a medieval workshop could account for the image. The energy levels required are not in the very bright light range. They are in the intensity we have no physical mechanism to produce range. A separate line of research has investigated corona discharge, the kind of electrical discharge that occurs when a strong electric field ionizes the air around a conductor, producing a faint glow and potentially surface chemical effects. Some researchers have proposed that a strong enough electric field, interacting with a body and a cloth, could produce surface oxidation consistent with the shroud image. The problems with this model are similar to those with the light models. Corona discharge naturally produces fringe effects and diffusion patterns that are not present in the shroud image, and the field strength required to produce the depth and extent of alteration observed would be, again, well outside the range of anything known to occur naturally or to have been achievable by any historical or modern technology. What all of these lines of investigation converge on is a consistent and somewhat uncomfortable conclusion. The image on the shroud was produced by a mechanism that deposited energy at the surface of linen fibers with extraordinary uniformity at extraordinarily shallow depth across an extraordinarily large area, encoding spatial distance information with a precision that only emerges when the image is analysed with equipment that didn't exist until the 20th century, and the energy source. Required to do this is not something we can point to in any known physical process, natural or manufactured. The scientific community does not use the word impossible lightly, and most researchers stop short of using it here, preferring language like unexplained or anomalous or inconsistent with known mechanisms. But the gap between unexplained and the nearest known explanation is not a small one. It is a gap measured in orders of magnitude of energy, in physical principles that don't have a natural instantiation, and in a combination of image properties that no deliberate human attempt to reproduce has yet succeeded in fully replicating. Whether you find that gap theologically suggestive or just scientifically frustrating depends Again, entirely on what you brought to the question. The physics doesn't care either way. It just keeps returning the same answer. We don't know how this was done. We have been on a long journey through this story, and at some point in any investigation this thorough, you expect a resolution, a verdict. The moment where the evidence accumulates to a tipping point and the answer becomes unavoidable. That is, after all, how detective stories work. You follow the clues, you weigh the testimony, and eventually the picture comes together. The Shroud of Turin has been studied by physicists, chemists, forensic pathologists, textile historians, palynologists, imaging specialists, radiocarbon experts, biblical scholars, Vatican archivists, and computer artists. It has been photographed, X-rayed, spectrographically analysed, filtered through satellite imaging equipment, sampled, microscopically examined, and mathematically modelled. More scientific and historical effort has been concentrated on this single object than on almost any other artefact in human history. And at the end of all that effort, the honest answer is, we still don't know. Which is either deeply frustrating or the most fascinating thing about it, depending on how you're wired. What we do know, after everything we've covered, is worth stating clearly. We know the image is not paint. We know it is not any applied substance of any kind. We know it is a surface-level chemical alteration of the linen fibres themselves, at a depth measured in nanometers, with no known mechanism capable of producing it. We know it encodes three-dimensional spatial data in a way that no painting in history does, and that NASA equipment designed to map the moon reads it as a coherent physical surface. We know the bloodstain patterns are medically and forensically precise, in ways that go far beyond what medieval anatomical knowledge could have generated, with serum separation halos, correct postural fluid trails, and dual-component wound evidence. Consistent with first-century Roman execution methodology. We know the cloth has a weave consistent with ancient Eastern Mediterranean production. We know a companion cloth in Spain, documented since the 7th century, has blood stains that physically align with the face on the shroud and pollen from plants that only grow near Jerusalem. We know a 12th century Hungarian manuscript depicts what appears to be the same cloth with the same burn mark pattern, more than 300 years before the fire that supposedly caused those marks. We know the radiocarbon test that dated it to the medieval period was conducted on a sample that chemically differs from the rest of the cloth. And we know that every attempt to replicate the image's specific combination of properties by artists, photographers, physicists, laser technicians, and everyone else who has tried, has failed. That is an extraordinary accumulation of anomalies for one object. It is also not proof of anything in the theological sense, and it is important to be clear about that. Anomalies are not miracles. Unexplained properties are not the same as impossible properties. Every unexplained thing in the history of science eventually received an explanation, sometimes a mundane one, sometimes a revolutionary one, but always eventually one. The fact that we do not currently have a satisfactory physical explanation for the shroud image does not mean that one does not exist. It means we haven't found it yet. Science is comfortable with that. Science has a whole filing system for phenomena awaiting explanation, and it is quite large. But here is the thing that makes the shroud genuinely different from most items in that filing system. Usually, when science encounters an unexplained phenomenon, there is at least a plausible direction in which the explanation might lie. A category of mechanism, a physical principle that might be extended or modified to account for the observation. With the shroud, the more carefully the image properties have been characterized, the further the known mechanism landscape has retreated. The ENEA laser experiments didn't just fail to replicate the image. They established that the energy required to replicate it is beyond anything achievable by human technology. Jackson's model doesn't just describe a mechanism, it describes one with no known physical instantiation. The forensic details don't just match Roman crucifixion, they match it at a level of specificity that implies direct observation of something that no medieval or modern forger could have arranged. Every additional piece of precision analysis has made the problem harder to explain, not easier. That is not the usual trajectory of scientific investigation, and it is the thing that keeps researchers in the field who would otherwise have moved on years ago. So what does the shroud mean? This is the question that every person who has spent serious time with this subject eventually has to face, and the answers divide along lines that have very little to do with the evidence, and everything to do with the framework people bring to the evidence. The believer looks at the accumulated anomalies and sees a coherent pattern pointing toward a single extraordinary event, a resurrection, a transformation of a physical body that released energy in a form that left an imprint on the cloth. The image, in this reading, is not a photograph of a dead man. It is a recording of the moment a dead man stopped being dead. The blood is real because the wounds were real. The forensic precision is real because the body was real. The inexplicable energy mechanism is inexplicable because it is, by definition, outside the normal operation of physical law, which is what a miracle would be if miracles are real. The skeptic looks at the same evidence and sees a different pattern. Yes, the object is genuinely unusual. Yes, the forgery hypothesis requires an implausibly talented and knowledgeable medieval craftsman. Yes, the radiocarbon dating was compromised. But none of this proves ancient origin. An ancient origin does not prove supernatural origin. There have been extraordinary human achievements throughout history that we cannot replicate today. Lost technologies, lost techniques, things made by people with knowledge and skill that simply did not survive them. The image might have been produced by a method we haven't identified. The provenance chain might have gaps that were filled by legend rather than fact. The companion cloth might be associated by tradition rather than by actual shared history. The skeptic does not need to explain every anomaly. They only need to maintain that natural explanation, however elusive, is always more probable than supernatural explanation, which is a philosophically defensible position, and one that a lot of very intelligent people hold. The scientist, the researcher without a prior commitment to either conclusion, tends to sit in the most uncomfortable position of all. Because the scientific position, honestly held, is that the evidence is genuinely anomalous, and the current state of knowledge does not resolve it. The image properties are real. The mechanism is unknown. The provenance evidence is suggestive but not definitive. The radiocarbon result is compromised but not overturned. Every time a new analytical technique is applied, the object reveals another layer of complexity rather than simplifying. And the scientific process, which is very good at advancing toward answers in most domains, seems to slow down and get stuck when it turns to face this particular 14 feet of linen. That is not comfortable for scientists who are not accustomed to problems that resist indefinitely, but it is where they are. What is remarkable, and this is perhaps the genuinely unusual thing about the Shroud compared to other historical mysteries, is that it matters to people in a way that most archaeological puzzles simply do not. Nobody loses sleep over the exact dating of a particular Bronze Age settlement. Nobody gets into arguments at dinner parties about the weave pattern of an ancient garment from a random burial site. But the Shroud produces fierce engagement, strong emotion, and deeply held positions from people in every category: believers, skeptics, and researchers alike. It has been doing this for centuries, and the intensity has not diminished. If anything, as more has been discovered and the anomalies have deepened rather than resolved, the engagement has increased, which tells you something, even if you're not sure what. The cloth has outlasted every attempt to definitively categorize it. It survived the 1988 radiocarbon verdict that should have closed the debate. It survived decades of skeptical analysis that should have found the pigment that wasn't there. It survived physical examination that should have revealed the mechanism that remained hidden. It has been in continuous custody for at least 670 years of documented history, and if the silent witnesses mean what they appear to mean, considerably longer than that. It has been burned, flooded, handled, transported across continents, displayed to millions of people, and subjected to every analytical technique that human ingenuity has developed in the past century. And it sits in its climate-controlled case in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, looking exactly as mysterious as it has always looked, neither giving ground nor making any claims on its own behalf. This is, in the end, what the Shroud is: a question. Not a rhetorical question. Not a question with an obvious answer that people are being dramatic about. A genuine open question, in the most rigorous sense of that phrase. An object whose properties are documented, whose anomalies are real, whose mechanism is unknown, and whose implications, if it is what believers claim it is, are the largest that any physical object has ever carried. The relic doesn't tell you what to conclude, it shows you what the evidence is and leaves the rest entirely to you. And in a world that is saturated with confident voices telling you exactly what to think about everything, there is something almost refreshing about a 14-foot piece of linen that has been asked the same question for 2,000 years and has never, not once, given a straight answer. If you've made it this far, through the physics, the history, the forensics, the Templars, the Hungarian monks and their suspiciously accurate manuscript, then you have done what very few people bother to do. You have actually looked at the evidence. Not the headline version, not the scientists proved it's fake version, or the it's obviously a miracle version. The actual complicated, anomaly-filled, satisfyingly unresolved evidence. And now the question is yours, not anyone else's. Yours. What do you see when you look at the Shroud of Turin? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this kind of deep dive is your thing, hit subscribe, because there is no shortage of history that is stranger than fiction, and we are just getting started.